We are bringing you live coverage, folks, of the Stanley Liggins case out of Iowa. This is a case involving a defendant charged with murder, sex abuse, kidnapping, arson, and causing willful serious injury to 9-year-old Jennifer Lewis. This is an old case, and this is why we're hearing so much reading back into the record of previous transcript testimony. Francey Hakes is with us here on the Law and Crime Network to help us break all this down. Francey, good to see you again.
Hi, Aaron. Great to be with you.
So what do you make of all this reading back of this transcript testimony? This has been a very hard trial for some of our viewers to get into, and I have to assume the jurors are probably struggling that way as well.
They are, and it's only natural. Unfortunately, when you read testimony like this, it's just boring. This is not a boring case. There's nothing boring about the horrific death of this poor little girl or the man who's on trial for his life. But when you do so much reading, it's just boring, and I'm not sure the jury's paying attention. And that's unfortunate for the cause of justice.
Yeah, I mean, going back through the previous cases here, the first appeal, issues of jurisdiction, whether or not the defendant was a supplier of cocaine to the victim's mother and stepfather. And in the first case, they tried to link that all together and say this defendant knew them. But the appeals court had a big issue with that. Francey, can you elaborate a little bit?
Well, they did. They had a big issue because it looks like there was a great deal of material that was never turned over to the defense. And the Court of Appeals, of course, quickly reversed this case, even though it's been a really long time since he was first tried. The case is almost 2 decades old now. But that's a lesson for prosecutors. You have got to make sure you turn over everything. Justice demands it. Fairness demands it.
Certainly. So, again, folks, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the Stanley Liggins case in Iowa. He's accused of killing 9-year-old Jennifer Lewis. His first 2 trials were flipped on appeal. He's back in a third trial. We're going to be back with more right after this quick break. Senator Amy Klobuchar there, a Democrat from Minnesota, questioning President Trump's pick for the U.S. Supreme Court. Judge Brett Kavanaugh currently sits on the D.C. Circuit. This is the second day of his confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee. I am joined by Francey Hakes here on the Law and Crime Network to sort of break this down. I have to ask this question, Francey. If the members of the panel were a judge and you were before them and you were answering questions the way Brett Kavanaugh is, would the judge stop you and interrupt and say, answer the specific question?
You know, Aaron, you always hope so, and that's what we're taught in law school, is to control the witness and make them answer your question directly. But I practiced in front of a lot of Southern judges to whom courtesy was more important than the actual rule and letter of the law, and so they would always let the witness explain their answer. And I think that's all we're seeing here, is that senators on both sides on these kinds of nominations for decades have tried to get the nominee to say something that they can then use against them. And so every nominee is always really careful to explain their answer so they don't get caught in some sort of trap.
How do you take the answers that are being given thus far? I mean, I think in this last line of questioning, Senator Klobuchar was really trying to pin him down and say something that she could then use as a political point. But he said, as you just mentioned, look, back up and look at the whole thing. The remedy isn't to trash this federal agency. The remedy would just be to change the way it operates.
Well, and you heard her distinctly just misunderstand what he said, because she repeatedly said you wanted to find this agency unconstitutional. And he repeatedly said to her, that isn't what I said. That wasn't what my opinion said. But this is a classic back and forth between people from different parties with different judicial philosophies. And we see it every time there's a major court nominee.
It will continue as we roll along through the second day of confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Again, this is the Senate Judiciary Committee. A real back and forth here. Republicans, Democrats, both asking questions. We will be back after this break here on Law and Crime. We are continuing our live coverage, folks, for the confirmation hearings of Supreme Court pick Brett Kavanaugh. Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, a Democrat from that state, continuing her questioning of the candidate. Francey Hakes is with me here at the Law and Crime Network to keep breaking this down. We're hearing questions about agency law, commerce. This stuff might sound dry, but the bottom line is that it affects pretty much everybody at this point.
It does, Aaron. Antitrust laws, mergers of major corporations, especially when you're talking about health insurers or communications companies, these ultimately can affect the price that consumers pay for goods and services. And so while it does sound dry and distant, it actually is something that affects everyday Americans.
So he keeps getting hit with questions about his dissents, and I keep hearing this come up, dissent, dissent, dissent. Well, what's the focus on dissent all about here?
Well, I think, Aaron, the focus is they're trying to say you were wrong. You did not agree with the majority, and so you lost, and therefore your reasoning must have been suspect somehow because the other two judges didn't agree with you. So I think it's really just a way of gigging Judge Kavanaugh and saying you dissented, and by the way, you lost.
Well, you know, that's kind of an interesting way to look at dissents, because I had an appellate judge tell me a few years ago that some of the reason judges dissent is to put a strongly worded counter-argument on the record. I've heard judges tell me that. Do you think that that's applicable here, or do you think that it's not applicable here?
No, I think it is, Aaron. I mean, I think that's exactly why judges do long opinions. The Supreme Court justices are known for their long and complicated and convoluted dissents because they want the public to know why they don't agree with what the majority opinion is.
Well, we're going to take a quick break here on the Law&Crime Network, and when we come back, we will continue our coverage of the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. We will be right back in just a moment here on Law&Crime. We are live in the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings with the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C., and here to help me break them down is attorney Francey Hakes. Now we're watching Senator Ted Cruz, a Republican, question President Trump's candidate. I counted 4 softball questions off the bat there. Were you ever asked questions like this in law school, Francey?
Oh, Aaron, come on. You know this is all political theater. The other side does it when their nominees are up. Everybody does it when their own nominee is up. They try to throw a softball question at him to allow the nominee to look good and to opine on a subject that they think that most of the public is going to agree with. And then the other side's goal is to try to make the nominee look bad. This is all political theater.
Well, it sounds like an indictment into the entire process of having these hearings. And I've seen some people come back up and say, hey, why do we televise these if they just turn into, to use your words, political theater?
You know, that's a great point. I read something today that someone was recommending that they just do written questions so that there is maybe that would lead to less politicization in the process. So just ask written questions of the nominee and then have a vote. I mean, it certainly would take away from, I think, the public's knowledge. I think it's important that the public sees these nominees. Supreme Court justices, especially in the last 30 years, have had tremendous impacts on the daily lives of Americans on criminal law, consumer issues, healthcare issues. And so I do think it's important that we see them, but unfortunately, politics is injected in everything.
It is, and look, I think that there's an element of nonverbal communication that comes into play here, that not only do we see, or not only rather do we listen to a candidate's answers, but we see the way that they're behaving under some harder questions and some softer questions. And of course, we're watching that go down here. I don't see anyone really on any side of this equation saying that they think that Brett Kavanaugh is an unwise man. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break here on Law and Crime. We'll be back with more after this. We are continuing our live coverage of the confirmation hearings for U.S. Supreme Court pick Brett Kavanaugh. Francey Hakes is an attorney. She's with us here on the Law and Crime Network. She joins us frequently. Francey, one point of agreement here that I heard was Senator Whitehouse said that he agreed with Ted Cruz that Capitol Police are handling the protesters well. And in the midst of some questions about fundamental liberties, constitutional liberties, enumerated liberties, free speech, free religion, we saw yet again loud outbursts in the gallery.
Yeah, you know, Aaron, it's something that actually bothers me quite a bit. I mean, where's the decorum? Where is the civility that we hear so much about when one side doesn't like what the other side is saying? Instead of letting them speak, which is fundamental protections under the First Amendment that Judge Kavanaugh is actually talking about, they're trying to just shout them down so that the rest of us cannot hear what Judge Kavanaugh is saying in response to questioning. So I think the Capitol Police are doing a great job. I've seen some videotape of them yanking these people out of the hearing room pretty quickly when they start shouting. And so I think it was certainly right to thank them. But why are they shouting down Judge Kavanaugh in the first place?
I have to wonder, I mean, his answers are the important equation that is up for examination right now. But a lot of people are afraid that he's going to sit on the court and basically take away their liberties.
Well, people say that, and people have been saying that about conservatives for probably 30 years. It was said about Scalia and Thomas and Roberts and Gorsuch and everyone else, and abortion is still legal in this country, and we still have lots of fundamental rights that have not been taken away. Obamacare is still the law of the land. So I really think it's just hysterical, and I don't mean funny. I mean just people are hysterical about nominees, and they go too far. You can disagree with his political positions, his policy, his background, and even the way you think he may rule. But the extreme view that somehow he's going to cause the death of women, and I think it was Senator Booker who said anyone supports him is supporting evil, is simply ridiculous.
Yeah, some of this is ramped up pretty far down the chain of, to use your word, I don't know if I'd use the word ridiculous, but it's obtuse. Look, we're going to take another quick break here on the Law&Crime Network. We will be back with more live coverage of the confirmation hearing when we return. Tough questions there from Democratic Senator Chris Coons. He's a senator from Delaware. He was born in Connecticut. That's why I got a little bit tongue-tied earlier, but I just want to make sure I correct that and be clear. Senator from Delaware asking questions on behalf of the Democrats. Francey Hakes is with us here on the Law&Crime Network.
Humphrey's executor, they might have cited Morrison, but the principle...
They literally said, and I quote, Morrison remains valid and binding precedent, and
in how it applied Humphrey's.
Criticized your minority as flying in the face.
On is the independent counsel law, and equating it really, ultimately I think his goal is to equate it with the Mueller investigation, who's a special counsel, and hope that the public doesn't know that there is a big distinction between the independent counsel law that has expired and under which Mueller is not working, and the special counsel rules and regulations that Mueller is working under the Department of Justice.
He is trying to make that distinction. I think Senator Coons keeps pushing the issue further and further and further, trying to pin him down on a specific answer. Judge Kavanaugh is probably not used to being cross-examined that way.
No, and I have to tell you, I've testified a few times, and I've actually testified before Congress a couple of times, and it is a nerve-wracking experience, and I have to admit, I am not brilliant like Judge Kavanaugh and really every other Supreme Court justice nominee that has come before the Senate judiciary in the last several decades, and so I think he's doing a great job of answering where he can and avoiding answering where he needs to.
An interesting point came up yesterday that I think is worth underscoring because I happen to agree with it. One of the big issues that a number of senators have brought up is, hey, look, we are almost looking too much or asking too much of our Supreme Court justices. Certainly they should be educated. Certainly they should be wise. Certainly they should be open-minded. But we haven't amended the Constitution in a long, long time, and a lot of issues that could be settled by the legislative branch are getting shoved to the court. That was the tone yesterday. I'm waiting to see if it comes up today. We will be right back. Welcome back. We are watching live confirmation hearing proceedings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh. He is President Trump's pick for the U.S. Supreme Court. Francey Hakes is with me here on the Law&Crime Network. Francey, I wanted to give you a chance to sort of respond to this idea that I brought up earlier that we heard a lot about yesterday, that we're almost asking too much of Supreme Court justices because we just don't want to go through the more difficult steps of trying to form consensus on these hot-button issues. And as such, our Constitution has not been amended in quite some time. And legislatively, we break down over these issues. So is it too much to keep asking justices to read into words like the word liberty in the document to try to come up with answers to really hot-button pressing social issues?
It is, Aaron. I don't think it's fair to ask judges to do it. I don't think it's their job, and I don't think they're the ones who should be doing it. Our elected officials, our whole constitutional system is set up to make our elected officials, the members of Congress, the most responsive to the people. It's not the judges and it's not the executive branch. It's the legislative branch that is supposed to be the most responsive to the people. That's why the House is up for a re-election every 2 years and each senator up every 6, so that the people can decide whether or not their representatives are doing the kind of legislation or passing the kind of legislation that we accept. And we are expecting too much of our judges. They're not super legislators, and yet both sides treat them that way.
I think the public oftentimes treats him that way as well. Well, look, we're going to take another quick break here on the Law and Crime Network in just a couple of minutes. Just to recap, though, some of the questions from Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, Democrat, asking Judge Kavanaugh if he has enthusiasm for overturning precedent and really trying to pin him down on statutes involving independent counsel, special counsel, differentiating between those two. This goes to the heart of the Mueller inquiry. We will be right back with more live coverage of that hearing in just a moment here on Law and Crime. Republican Senator Sass there asking Judge Kavanaugh specifically about some of the statements protesters have said, but he prefaced it with the response from himself that he didn't believe the protesters who are back there in the Senate Judiciary Committee gallery, at times jumping up, raising a storm about their perception that Brett Kavanaugh would be a bad pick for the U.S. Supreme Court. Francey Hakes, it's interesting to actually see some of those protesters' statements be brought in front of the judge here.
It is, and I think Senator Sass had it exactly right. If the protesters were right, that is, if Brett Kavanaugh believed that Donald Trump was immune to any consequences of criminality, then no one should support Judge Kavanaugh. But that, of course, is not what Judge Kavanaugh thinks. And I think the discussion that he had with Senator Coons was really interesting because the senator wanted to talk a lot about whether or not a sitting president can be indicted. And of course, the Constitution, the founders prescribed what I think is the only method to remove a president from office while they're sitting, and that is impeachment. It's a political decision. That's why high crimes and misdemeanors in the Constitution are not otherwise defined, because it's up to Congress to decide when and if a president has committed that. If you think about it, Aaron, think of all the DAs that you and I have seen and talked about in trials around this country. If maybe half of them are on the other party from the president, and they decide they're going to indict a sitting president and harry him throughout his entire term, that president would be facing criminal charges and answering those charges in half the courts across the country, and he would be absolutely paralyzed.
At least the courts where he or she is unpopular.
That's right. And obviously, President Trump is very unpopular. But the Constitution prescribes the one method to remove him. And if Congress wants to do it, then that's what they should do.
And if Congress doesn't want to, then that's where it ends.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's why the founders, I think, were smart about it, because as Brett Kavanaugh said, after 9/11, he got a really up close and personal view of the pressures that a president faces. And I think it makes good sense to have the political branches making those decisions.
Yeah, that's a well-stated position. Okay, some people may disagree with it, but it's at least well-stated. I think some of the questioning is really kind of getting around the backside of what Brett Kavanaugh's actual position is. I wish that the questioning would bring that out a little bit more. Anyway, Francey Hakes, great to see you today on Law and Crime. We're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Aaron.
Okay, we are going to continue our coverage of the Judiciary Committee hearing on our website, lawandcrime.com. For now, we're going to wrap up the live broadcast today. This is Aaron Keller, and for all of us here on the Law and Crime Network, we will be right back, I'm told.